Howdy, I'm Nolan Gray, your friendly neighborhood city planner, research director here at California YIMBY, and one of the co-leads of the new Metropolitan Abundance Project. Welcome back to the Abundance Podcast. In this episode, I chat with Sarah Karlinsky. Sarah is the research director at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation at UC Berkeley, where she leads the development of the center's research agenda. Prior to joining the Terner Center, Sarah worked at Spur, a leading Bay Area urban policy think tank. Sarah's published on a wide variety of topics, including housing governance, middle-income housing, long-range planning for housing affordability, historic preservation, and the intersection between disaster resilience and housing policy. In this episode, we talk about her new report, Structured for Success, Reforming Housing Governance in California and the Bay Area. I think you're really going to enjoy it. Before we jump in, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, like, leave a comment, anything to juice those numbers, and let us know who you want to hear from in the future. With that, on to the show. Hey, Sarah, welcome to the Abundance Podcast.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
And we're glad to have Robyn, my colleague, our, Director of Strategic Partnerships, right?
That's title.
Right.
Cool. Well, let's dive right in. Sarah, you've written an amazing paper, Structured for Success, Reforming Housing Governance in California and the Bay Area. So I guess just starting at maybe the most obvious place here, we'll kind of set the ground a little bit with some of the jargon and your general argument, then we can explore themes. But okay, housing affordability in California. We just need to fix the zoning. We just need to get rid of the parking requirements. What is this housing governance, and why does anybody need to think about it?
It's a great lead-in. Thanks for setting it up that way. Yeah, so maybe I'll just step back and talk a little bit about the inception of the report, and that will help answer your question. So I was asked to write about housing governance, and at first I was like, I don't really know what that means. Like when I start thinking about this topic of housing governance, it really could be sort of anything when you really start thinking about it, because our entire zoning and land use framework is obviously it's a legal framework that itself is part of governance. But when I really took a step back, it made me start thinking about institutions and what institutions are in charge of what vis-a-vis housing, and how complex it is in the Bay Area for a variety of different reasons. So first, I think as definitely you all know that the Bay Area has just an enormous number of cities. So we have 101 cities in the Bay Area, each with its own government, each with its own political logic. And when I started off working in land use and housing policy, that's where all the action was. This was pre-YIMBY. You were just but a glimmer in the eye of those of us who care about housing policy. So everything was the local government gets to decide what gets built where. If you want to try to support housing, you go to the local city council or the board of supervisors, and you testify and you plead with them, and they can say yay or nay. There were some kind of restrictions on that, but largely because California has such a strong tradition of home rule, it was really what the local city council or the board of supervisors said went. And if you replicate kind of that political logic over and over and over again, where there's a lot of incentive to say no and relatively little incentive to say yes, then you get a housing crisis, right? And that's like the history of land use in California. And then we've got, our regional government that has some authority over how federal transportation dollars are expended, but not that much power over land use really. And then there's the state, and something happens up there and we don't really know what. And that was really the story, I would say, for me, definitely through the early 2000s into the mid 2000s. But the story has really changed, I would say, in the last 5 to 10 years. And part of that has to do with just the power of the YIMBY movement at the local level. I mean, having YIMBY show up and say, we need housing, and do so in numbers, and having young people part of the movement change the dynamics, certainly at the local level. But then also the state conversation really changed. And part of that was the result of I would say, being a kind of a Bay Area person, that the Bay Area delegation to the state Senate and Assembly was like particularly strong around housing. There was this whole process called CASA that was very, that was basically like a group that was assembled by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission in the Bay Area to talk about housing. And they had kind of a coalition of unusual bedfellows, if you will, moving legislation. But all of a sudden there's like state legislation happening about housing, and maybe more than usual. And then the energy started shifting statewide. So this is a very long way of answering your question. But I sort of become fascinated with these different levels of government, where the authorities are within each level, and like how both, if you change kind of the levers of authority at the state level, you can actually have this incredibly large downstream effect. And part of that is kind of a legislative agenda, but part of it has to do with the institutions themselves. So again, long answer to your question, but that's how we got to where the paper ended up.
So, I mean, maybe starting from the bottom and moving up. Historically, right, most of these planning decisions are made almost entirely at the local level. We delegate zoning and other powers down to local governments. Why not just continue with the way things used to work, right? Like, here in California, we've shifted a lot of our efforts to the state level, but the most natural place to focus advocacy almost seems like at the local level, right? Why not take that approach? Why look at these issues at a state level, which I think is historically not how we did it?
For several reasons. So one is, and I alluded to this in my first answer, the political dynamics at the local level privilege those who already live in a community. So the people who already live there elect the local leaders. The local leaders are fundamentally going to be responsive to the needs of their constituents. And if their constituents say, gee whiz, oh, I'm really uncomfortable with this housing. Ooh, you want to go up 4 stories? I don't know about that. And they limit housing production because, if your city council member X and your neighborhood is really up in arms about, housing development in their neighborhood, it's going to take an act of extraordinary political courage to go against the people who might be responsible for your reelection. So that's the dynamic in every city, pretty much, or was the dynamic in every city. And if you replicate that over and over and over again, you basically have a patchwork quilt of local governments that aren't building enough housing. There's no kind of higher authority that's saying, hey, wait a minute, if you add up all of these local decisions, what you end up with is not enough housing. So it's very problematic. That's not to say that local government should have nothing to say about housing, but they shouldn't. The absolute ability to say yes or no to housing should not rest at the local level.
Yeah, well, and I mean, for every local government that's leading with exciting reforms, like in Emeryville or San Diego or Santa Monica in recent years, you probably have like 20 that are doing absolutely nothing or kind of cranking things in the opposite direction, right?
Yeah, I would just give an example. So before, I work at the Terner Center for Housing Innovation now. Before that, I worked at Spur, but before that, I worked for an affordable housing developer on the peninsula. And even before my time, my boss told me the story. It was truly one of the most unbelievable development stories I've ever heard, where basically there was a jurisdiction in the Bay Area that I will not name, and there were a bunch of nuns, and the nuns wanted to give land for the development of affordable housing to this nonprofit. And they would have to rezone the land, so it had to go through a process. And the things that were uttered at the hearings were things like, this is a Papist plot, a Papist plot to house poor people.
Is this in like 1890 or something?
It was not. It was like 1995 5 or something. We don't want those people in our neighborhoods with their boom boxes. Just like all of it. And it took forever, and my boss had to threaten to sue under the federal fair housing law, but the properties got developed as affordable housing. But the amount of brain damage that had to be gone through is just outrageous. And that's like but one story. And I'm sure if you talk to certainly affordable housing developers in the 90s and the early 2000s, you would hear very, very similar stories.
So Sarah, you're talking a lot about the findings of the political intractability, the reasoning for exploring how you change housing governance. I loved a lot of the pieces of your reports, the recommendations that emphasize the importance of having that vision that you were talking about a minute ago. And I was wondering if you could share a bit more about kind of how you came to those recommendations, especially around envisioning new agencies and specifically, how they would address some of these local intractable issues you're talking about.
Yeah. So in the paper, we call for the creation of 2 new agencies, which are really kind of reconceptualizations of existing functions in state government that just aren't working very well. So the first is the creation of what we call a California housing agency. And that's basically looking at state government and seeing, okay, first of all, affordable housing funding is spread across all these different functions, all of these different departments, if you will, across 2 constitutional officers. There's so much waste in the system. And Spur was not the first to figure this out. California Housing Partnership wrote about this. The state auditor wrote like a scathing, fire-breathing report about how wasteful this is. We know that this is a problem. So can we basically try to combine all of the housing finance functions in one agency? Like that would be huge. Have it align with a plan for where we actually want affordable housing to go. That would be huge. And then, yeah, I know, right? Like, wow, that would be really nifty if we could do that. And then, really have, this is one thing that I found over and over again, is other parts of government are just like going on their merry way and coming up with rules and regulations about this and that. And they don't take into account the impacts on housing production that would occur. So, for example, if you charge a lot of extra fees to clean up toxic sites, like that sounds great. But if you want those sites to be housing and you charge a lot of fees, then maybe you render that infeasible. Like one example amongst many. So really having a kind of a developed function that could explain to other parts of government what the impacts are on housing production would be huge. So that's kind of the idea around the housing, California Housing Agency. And then the second thing I looked at was the planning function of state government. And what I found is that the state of California has no articulated land use vision. They have no articulated land use vision. They have like different documents that exist that articulate aspects, but there's no kind of unified vision for like, where do we want housing and where do we not? And this will come as no surprise to the 2 of you because you worked really hard at trying to figure out what that might look like with AB 68. But yeah, it's the last time there was a adopted land use vision in the state of California, it was 1978. So that was a long time ago. And it would be nice if we had basically a kind of a space where there's to develop a land use vision, where there's a California planning agency. We call for the basically the dissolution of the existing Office of Planning and Research and kind of a reconstitution in an agency that would be headed by a secretary whose job would be to articulate the land use vision for the state of California and talk about what happens when there are conflicts between different different policy priorities, if you will, and how to actually resolve some of those tensions between these priorities, as opposed to sort of saying to the region and the locals, hey, we want you to affirmatively further fair housing and we want you to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, like go figure it out. Be like, no, like we're actually going to think about how you might deal with some of those conflicts.
So I'm going to keep leaning into this posture as like tedious defender of the status quo. Sarah, we already do all this stuff, right? We already have RHNA. We allocate how much housing locals need to build. Regional housing needs assessment. We already have SCS, the sustainable community strategies. So we have all this statewide planning, urban governance in place. What's the problem?
Well, great. I love that you're leaning into that posture. It's very fun to see you be a defender of the status quo, which is the literal opposite of how I think of you. So it's very charming.
We can role play a little bit.
Yeah. So I would say a couple of things. We still have a housing crisis, and we still don't have really a plan for where we build, and we kind of make it up as we go along. And some things have changed over time to be much, much better. And I would say the regional housing needs allocation process is one of those things, thanks to State Senator Scott Wiener, who ran a bill several years ago to really kind of titrate the way that RHNA functions, and how the regional housing needs allocation is calculated at the state level, so that regions are basically planning for a sufficient amount of housing, but also creating actual sticks. I mean, that's the long and the short of it, right? Like, it's only in this cycle of RHNA that local governments are actually concerned about what happens if they don't adopt housing elements. So it actually has finally some teeth, and I think that's a good thing, and I think it's something that can be built on. When you talk about the sustainable community strategy, which is a very different process, it's a second regional planning process that takes up an inordinate amount of time and doesn't produce very much. And actually, one thing that we really wrestled with in the paper is, do we just call for doing away with it entirely? And we actually decided not, because although we're all housers here on this podcast, there actually are other land use. There are other land uses that need to be planned for, and thinking about the linkage between transportation and land use is very, very important. But it really makes no sense to require regions to do two separate regional plans, and only one actually has teeth and only one matters, and the other is kind of largely a paper exercise. So how can we actually take the most important aspects of the SCS, retain those and strengthen them, and then have the RHNA kind of nest within that? That I think is the next iteration of regional planning needs to grapple with that.
So just for our listeners who might not be terribly familiar, kind of a quick rundown, and you all can provide feedback. RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Assessment, every 8 years, the Department of Finance tries to figure out, okay, how much housing does the state of California need to build over these next 8 years to meet our housing needs based on population and economic indicators. They allocate it among the major metropolises of California, aka councils of governments, or COGs, and then those COGs allocate it among individual cities and counties. Those cities and counties then need to write what's called a housing element, where they come up with a plan for the next 8 years to allow their fair share of housing. That housing element has to be certified by HCD, Housing and Community Development. And the dream is everybody adopts these great plans. They implement, a whole bunch of housing gets built. Historically, that absolutely hasn't been the case. But in the current cycle we're in, the process is a lot more robust and a lot stricter. And so the hope is that this might work well. But so far, it seems to be a little bit unclear if it's really going to work. Robyn, I don't know if you want to take a whack at doing something like that for SCS, Sustainable Community Strategies.
Well, so I think that's where actually I had a question here, Sarah.
Oh, perfect.
We have these sustainable community strategies plans created through SB 375, right? Great plans where the goal is, how do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? primarily from personal, like transportation cars, right? That's the kind of guiding principle, but they are these vast planning exercises that go across transportation, housing, all centered on land use, right? And land use is unfortunately left out, right? It was left on the cutting room floor in this whole planning process. So I'm curious, in your tying these two kind of parallel planning process that don't really talk to one another together, some of your major recommendations are connecting them better, which I think are fantastic. I'm curious, in tying them together, how can we make sure to take some of the successes of RENA reform that we've gained forward, and in addressing reforms to the sustainable community strategies, which fundamentally have hit political roadblocks again and again, even when, they have more positional power relatively within the California state government. And, this kind of goes along with your recommendation of pulling out the California Housing Agency and California Planning Agency as separate state level agencies versus being within the governor's office. And I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about how we make sure to keep that kind of special sauce of RENA reform success and housing enforcement going, while applying that also to sustainable community strategies and how this all fits within the governance changes. So sorry, a lot of questions in there.
Yeah, no, those are great. So I thought about that a lot actually, because you don't want to water down the RENA process. Like now we're finally like cooking, like we're finally getting somewhere with some of this housing planning stuff, and you definitely don't want to undermine that. So what are the ways that we can have basically the SES kind of build on some of the successes of RENA? So one thing, and this might be sort of simple and wonky, but the state gives regions their regional housing need determination, which is the number of housing units that they need to plan for in the next 8-year period. And it's an 8-year regional housing needs determination. As I understand it, the SB 375, the law that created the SESs, basically says that there must be consistency between the amount of housing that the regions plan for in their SESs and the RENA allocation. Oh, and then I should mention the SES is a 30-year planning time horizons. So some regions say, oh, well, if the SES is planning for 30 years and RENA is planning for 8, then logic would dictate that you'd be planning for a lot more housing in your SES than you are in your RENA, and that you're really doing kind of that forward thinking, okay, we're doing an 8-year plan, but then we're going to do a 30-year plan. And so we need to plan for a lot more housing in that 30-year horizon. But some other regions really don't see that. They just meet the letter of that concurrence law, and they just plan for basically a little bit more housing in their SES than they do in their RENA. And then they say, oh, it's concurrent, go on with life. So what if, for example, we simply tell the state, please come up with a 8-year regional housing need determination, and then come up with a 28-year one. And then the regions just plan for appropriate amount of housing. That's it's a super small fix that would make a huge difference. And I think you guys did you run a bill kind of like that at some point no? Okay. Maybe I'm
not sure.
Maybe I'm just, it was a vision. Maybe it's a dream I had.
Sarah, we're drowning in beautiful bills over here. It's hard to. No, that is a great idea and such a simple. I think my sense is, and maybe you disagree. My sense is that there's a little bit of fatigue about tinkering with RENA right now, and maybe except outside the context of something like a grand reimagining, I think part of what you're envisioning.
Yeah.
In Sacramento. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's one little thing. But then another thing that could happen, which is something actually that I will give a lot of kudos to the planners at MTC, because they actually did this in Plan Bay area, where they basically used, they did a real plan for how much housing they might have over the next 30 years that was much larger than their 8-year allocation. And then they kind of used that modeling exercise as it was basically the groundwork for their RHNA allocation process. And they assembled a committee, which they're supposed to do, and said, okay, if you're going to put housing in the places that are most advantageous to reduce climate, this is our sort of baseline plan from our SES for how you would do that. Now, there are other factors you need to consider as part of the regional housing needs allocation process that are outlined in statute, all of the different values that need to be maximized for. Using this SES land use modeling as a baseline, how would you include these other factors? And so they actually, I'm not describing it as elegantly as they did, but they basically merged the methodologies and used their SES plan as kind of like a baseline for their RHNA process. And I think that was very effective. And I think other regions could do that, and they probably should do that. So that's like kind of a second thing. And then the third thing is you could just require everything to be concurrent. I mean, that's something you could just do. You could just say, hey, local government, your rezoning needs to be concurrent with needs to conform to your RHNA. And then it also needs to conform to the SES. And then lo and behold, the SES would matter. So,
I mean, let's talk about SCS for a minute, because Robyn and I, AB 68, this is the bill to try to make it significantly easier to build ministerially in info context and potentially make it a little bit harder to build in greenfield context where there were environmental hazards. One of the things that struck us is, one, a lot of COGs, councils of governments, had not even really created like a map of SCS priority growth or priority development areas. So under the laws that exist today, they're supposed to create these maps where they identify their priority growth or development areas. The major COGs had created these, but the vast majority of COGs were like, we emailed them and they're like, what is this? Like, we've never heard of this, right? And that was a weird problem. The second weird problem was they dramatically sort of varied in how they approached this, right? So if I recall, ABAG was like picking like very specific sites, and it was all locally nominated sites. And then SCAG was like, yeah, if you're within like a half mile of any rapid transit, you're in, right? And so I wonder, like, I mean, part of with SCS, like, is there just low-hanging fruit and kind of getting COGs to do this work somewhat consistently? It's a little bit of a leading question, but I'm curious to hear what you think about, like,
yes. Yes. I think you could just have them use the same definitions for what constitutes like a priority development area, have them use the same nomenclature so that, when basically people are trying to conduct state level analyses, they're talking about the same things. They could release, and I think they're required to by law, but we haven't seen it yet. One thing you both spend a lot of time digging for is VMT, low VMT mapping. They could make that available to planners. So there's just like a bunch of like good government cleanups that would make thinking about kind of statewide planning much more coherent, just through rationalizing some of the definitions that these regions are using to describe certain things.
Another aspect of this that I think is worth unpacking a little bit, right, is you take Civics 101 and you're like the three kind of sort of levels of government: local, state, federal. But we've kind of, since the 60s, built this weird pseudo fourth level of government, which is regional planning and MPOs and COGs, and they're kind of sort of the same thing. And do you want to maybe talk a little bit about that and what your vision for regional planning would be in a like Sarah Karlinsky housing governance dictator universe?
Yeah, as we know, California is a very, very, very large state. And so it's important to think about priorities across the state, but it's actually hard to plan at the scale of the state because of just its size and complexity. and the state has just like enormous regional variation. So so thinking about that scale of a region is really important. You know, it's like it's a job shed, it's a housing market. It's kind of the region at which, or the scale at which people live. Like people don't often just stay like within their own jurisdiction. They venture out to work or play or whatever it might be. And so they're important. It's like just an important scale. That being said, thinking about what powers a region might have is it's a little tricky, because you don't want to give a region sort of like total land use power. It feels like that the authority that the state has, it feels like it ought to stay at the state. But the region should have kind of powers to corral, to plan, to ensure, again, kind of consistency between local governments and regional plans. So I do actually, even though it is flawed, kind of hold up the regional housing needs allocation process as like a potentially effective model, because the state is very clear about what the state does. The state says these are kind of the priorities, the policy priorities for the RHNA process. These are the number of housing units you region must plan for. And then at the regional scale, they think about how to distribute those units to the local governments, and then they run a process. I think a little bit more authority could be given to deal with recalcitrant local governments that might not want to appropriately accept their regional housing needs allocation process. So in my dictatorship, the region might get to override the local government if their local government really is not doing what they're supposed to do in terms of their planning priorities. But it is a little tricky, because you spoke of the cogs earlier, and the cogs really are just made up of leaders of local government. So it's not like the cog is some like magically different political animal. I mean, every so often you get like an incredible leader like a Jesse Arreguín, who has been the head of ABAG and really kind of led that cog through its regional housing needs allocation process in a very capable manner. But it's kind of a luck of the draw sometimes about who you get. And oftentimes smaller, potentially more NIMBY jurisdictions have just as loud, if not louder voices than the more urban parts. So you know, they're tricky animals when you think about them from a political perspective.
I'm curious, Sarah, with the political perspective in mind, but also thinking politically around different advocacy groups. I see one of the powers of regional governance is, you're a little closer. I think you talk about this a bit in the report, where, local government has a role because they understand fully the local context. Big changes can happen at the state level. And so I see the regional planning, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, as being that kind of prioritization point. And on that line of kind of thinking, I'm curious, when you're talking about this housing theory of everything, which I read a lot in your report, there's transportation, there's climate change, there's conservation, right? There's social mobility and economic opportunity kind of all tied up in that housing theory of everything. But each of those individual sectors has advocacy groups and constituencies. So I'm curious how you envision either kind of the MPOs at regional level, or the new California Planning Agency or California Housing Agency at the state level, kind of playing referee with these conflicting goals. And how do you, make folks stick to a plan? And does the plan itself become the goal?
Ooh, that last one is tricky, because, you can do a plan, and unless it's binding, as we see in the SES, doesn't matter, right? It has to matter. Otherwise, it's just words. Maybe I'll take the first part of your question first, which is like, how do you balance all the different constituencies. And I mean, the short answer is I don't know, but I like to think that if we know that we want to build 2.5 million housing units over the next 8 years, and we know we want to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. I don't remember what the target is, which I guess shows you my personal predilections to what I pay attention to, but that's something I do care about also. Like, and if we want to drive them down to wherever they're supposed to be, and we take those as like two core values that our state holds. Oh, and by the way, a certain percentage of the housing that we build needs to be affordable, and it can't just be in low income areas. It needs to be in high opportunity areas. If we say these are our values, then there has to be a place where those are wrestled with, right? And there will be constituencies, hollering for this, that, and the other. But if we hold our values to be true and we're really trying to maximize to get to both of them, then that's only going to lead to like a certain number of outcomes. And I believe that it can be done. I absolutely do. I know it can. It's just getting to that plan and then telling everybody who isn't maximizing for both of those values, especially if what they're maximizing for isn't in necessarily the public interest, that, sorry, like, this is what we're doing. So it takes political courage, right? Which I didn't write into the paper. I didn't say, oh, and also have political courage, and be a really great leader and be persuasive. And, like, that's obviously essential to getting anything done.
Yeah. Step one, the return of King Arthur, who will administer these things. And no, I mean, it's true though. I mean, and this is, in that sense, it's not too terribly different from the way things work today. I mean, one of the things that worries me is, in many ways, we're actually in a really, the stars have kind of aligned, right? Like, we have an attorney general who's fully on board with enforcing state housing law. We have a governor that I think, folks, maybe they want more out of this or that agency, but broadly speaking, the governor's office is backing pro-housing elements through the administration. You could totally envision a governor and an attorney general who are very much not on board with that. And I wonder if, like, we fantasize about like a post-political solution to these problems of like, oh, let's get the governance infrastructure right, and it doesn't matter who like fills these offices. It's always going to take courage and like attention by strong executives or strong attorney generals, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. So I did a report. It was on governance, but it had nothing actually to do with housing. It was just on like governance for the city of Oakland, and looking at like kind of how it was structured. And one of the politicians I interviewed was like, you know what? This report you're doing doesn't matter. It's just the people. She was like, if you have great people, all of this goes away. And if you have terrible people, no matter what you come up with, will not work. And there is truth in that. I mean, we've seen that at the federal level, when he who will not be mentioned was president. We have like all these rules and norms. And if you're hell-bent on destroying something, you can absolutely destroy it. Like, that can happen. But that being said, I do think that there are ways that we can be organized that could be more optimal than what we have right now, and can deliver better results, even if you have like average politicians. Let's just talk about like the most glorious of them all, nor the most terrible. Like, if you have just regular people and you have a better system, a better mousetrap, you can get more done.
Yeah. Well, just very quickly on this, because I think that's a really important point that we actually, like, we have an attorney general, we have a governor, we have leadership in the legislature that are all like actually broadly in agreement of like, yeah, we're pretty open to like some pretty radical changes. We need a huge like increase in housing. And yet it doesn't end up happening, I think, in part because of these deeper governance issues that you're identifying. So it's definitely not to say that like, oh, you just got to get the right people in and everything's okay. I think you're exactly right that we're in a case where I think we actually have a lot of pretty great people. But like things don't change because of deeper institutional problems that you're identifying. So sorry, just wanted to make it clear. I totally agree on the focus on institutions.
And I think you make that point a bit in the report with the rationale for pulling the California Planning Agency responsibilities from the Office of Planning and Research, right? That's under the governor's office versus an independent state agency. And I'm guessing there's some backstory there or run-ins. And I'm curious if you could kind of share a bit more about that recommendation and, specifically how that may or may not accelerate some changes that OPR currently has authority to do relative to CEQA streamlining, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a funny office, I will say. So I interviewed quite a lot of people, and the list of who I interviewed is in the paper. Very different opinions, actually, I heard about this recommendation, depending on like what era I would say the person is from. Like there are certain governors that worked very, very closely with OPR because they were aligned around like a particular policy agenda, let's say, and then others where it was sort of more disaligned, or the governor at the time was sort of less interested. But it in all instances, or almost all instances, I definitely heard that there was sort of, because the office is sort of an organ of the governor, it's not seen as like co-equal with the other agency heads. And also in recent years, there have been a lot of programs that have been added to OPR that have relatively little to do with housing or land use planning or long range land use planning. It sort of became, this is my own characterization and I hope it's not unkind, but a little bit of a junk drawer for the state, where they're like, I don't know what to do with this, and like pop it in there.
Well, yeah. Could you say a little bit more about what OPR, or the Office of Planning and Research, does for folks who might not be familiar with it?
Yeah, and yeah, I can. So basically, it's supposed to be where kind of long range planning for the state is taking place. They also have authority to issue guidelines for CEQA, and guidelines sound relatively weak when you say them as a term, but actually in the context of CEQA, they can be very, very strong in terms of the types of exemptions for projects that fall under those guidelines. So actually OPR could, if they wanted, they may not want to for a variety of political reasons, kind of be like, you know what, we really want to make sure that there are super strong infill exemptions, and we're going to write our rules to really favor infill housing. They might get called out for doing that. They might, have run into political problems with doing that, but they could do that if they wanted to. And then there are a variety, I'm sorry to say, there are a variety of other functions that now live in OPR that I don't remember what they were, because they're not related to long range land use planning. The other thing that is changing, that is a good thing, is that the staff at OPR for a long time basically could be fired at will. So it was like, that wasn't that great if you're trying to build out a professional staff, and now they're changing them to be civil service, which I think is going to be better.
I guess that recommendation really resonated with me in terms of hesitancy to engage with some of the authority granted. And
exactly.
So I thought that was really great. I was like, okay, let's give a little separation from the governor's office, and that being very wonky but meaningful. So
yeah, and like step into your power space, be like, okay, Like, we're responsible for long range land use planning. We're responsible for CEQA guidelines. Like, what is the vision for this state? And if it's truly like, we're going to build 2.5 million housing units over the next 8 years, and we're going to drive down, climate emissions, then that means infill is like the single most important thing we can do. And so we got to do it. And let's align everything. Let's align all of our systems to like go on an infill.
Picking up on something I think that was raised totally reasonably. I mean, yeah, is this just a plan? And, I'm wondering, like, let me just take a moment talking about, like, under what circumstances are plans impactful? Because I think, I've seen so many cities where actually having a clear long-range plan that actually did reflect a consensus provided cover to do some pretty radical things. This was what allowed Buffalo to be the first city to eliminate parking requirements. This is what allowed Minneapolis to be the first city to remove single-family zoning, right? When you really put the work in and have this clear vision, it can actually override a lot of the typical sources of like, no. And I'm curious, what sort of governance institutions have to be in place to maybe this is a variety of a question that I think Robyn asked earlier, but these are complex topics and themes, and we need to just chew on them over and over again. Yeah, how do you construct a state long range plan that actually has teeth and that's something that actually gets implemented?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I also have seen plans that actually lead to change, and it's pretty cool. And sometimes it's just like, honestly, like sheer exhaustion, like people fight and discuss and argue, but if they come to sort of a negotiated conclusion, then oftentimes that's what sticks. And if it does, if it's not a negotiated conclusion, or like the parties haven't exhausted themselves, then they just relitigate the whole thing sort of over and over. And I've seen that at the local level many times. So I guess I would say, in terms of what makes a successful plan, I think if people get to engage with it and kind of say their piece about it and feel heard, then that tends to be helpful. Although, there are times when there's just fundamental disagreement and one side is going to win, over the other side. I don't know how, like, I'll choose one that's a negative for something I believe in, which is Prop 13, right? I think you have like very different visions for the state, and the anti-tax people just like, they won. And that has had enormous negative, I wouldn't call that a plan necessarily, but it was a political thing that happened that led to negative outcomes. So I think, but I do think there's some engagement component that I think is really important. And then it has to like matter, there has to be either some teeth in there that matter. So again, I'm just thinking about this round of the regional housing needs allocation process. I know we keep coming back to it, but like in the jurisdiction where I live, which is kind of a smaller, high opportunity community, there were definitely people who were like, well, we just need to tell the state that we don't want to build this housing. Just go, council members, you work for me, like go up there and tell them that we don't want this housing. And that the council was like, no, we can't. We actually can't do that. So there's something about having some teeth at the end of the day that I think is really important. I feel like I'm rambling and I'm not necessarily getting to like the crux of what you're asking about, but
no, totally.
Yeah, I feel like those two pieces, like there's some grappling with it, and then there's some teeth, make them effective. The worst is when people spend all this time commenting on each other's plans, or writing plans, and then it doesn't matter. I see this with other, I hope I don't get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, like other elements of the general plan. Like, I don't know if you've ever gone and looked like at your community. Your community has like a safety element probably, and like an open space element, and it's not like RENA, there's no teeth. So it kind of doesn't matter. And like the housing element used to be like that too. Like I had an old boss who said, again, I guess I'm getting long into this interview, so I'm just speaking out of school a little bit, but he was like, it's like the Torah, you can find anything in there. Like that's what he said about the housing element. Like, it doesn't matter. It's just everything's in there and it doesn't matter. So if it's everything, it's nothing, right? And if there's no teeth, then who cares? It's just like writing stuff.
I think there's something powerful about having it be affirmative, though. In what you were talking about with Prop 13 and like the ability to just say no. I think that's always easier, right? It's a lot more comfortable for many folks, but having to come up with what you were affirmatively for in a plan, I think, is powerful in itself. If people are able to get it together and do it. Yeah, I think that's something I'm curious in terms of getting everyone aligned. You talk a lot about bringing a variety of different folks together, and the power in that California Planning Agency. This is a housing report, so obviously you're talking about housing. But I'm curious if you could, when I was kind of thinking that the California Planning Agency would likely also have authority over, all the different other land uses, right? Renewable energy, transmission lines that we desperately need, infrastructure, all of these things. So I was wondering if that was kind of also part of your vision and how you would see that playing out across a couple different sectors that, ultimately, hopefully feed back into that housing theory of everything.
Yeah, it's a great point. And certainly if there were no other land uses that we were planning for, then like the California Housing Agency could just do the land use plan because it would only be about housing. But of course, we have to think about all the other land uses, because there's also, there's economic development, there's planning for job growth, which has enormous impact on the land use patterns throughout our state. So yes, I definitely see certainly the California Planning Agency as trying to align all the various plans, because there's plenty of plans that are done right now. So like HCD does the statewide housing plan, and there's a transit plan that's done by the transit agency, energy planning, as you suggest. And right now there's no real requirement that they be aligned, driving towards the same thing and saying the same thing, and all rowing in the same direction. And I really see that the California Planning Agency as fulfilling that role. Like, number one, if nothing else, these plans should be internally consistent. This is one state, and we need to be coming up with something that is integrated, unified, and all rowing in the same direction.
And there's huge monetary implications of that as well,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, and that's the other thing that I put in. So, there's all the affordable housing funds that we have, but the state spends, billions and billions of dollars. And at minimum, there should be some audit that looks at how those funds are expended and what their land use implications are. And it would be wonderful if a second step, which we didn't recommend in the paper, but absolutely should happen after the audit's completed, like, let's try to unify our funding strategy so that all of our infrastructure is going towards the vision that we have for the state. But you want to talk about powerful interests that are aligned in other directions. I mean, that's where people start going like really ballistic. We're like, no, actually we actually want to be funding transit, and we actually want to be funding like bike and ped improvements, and we actually want to be, funding local road improvements as opposed to highway improvements. And actually we want to be building, again, more infill around all of this infrastructure that we're creating, as opposed to, the old way of like rolling out the roads and, building the new sprawl. That's definitely one way of doing things that we have done, but let's try to do things the other way and align our resources to make that happen.
I mean, the financing for cities is an important piece. I mean, also just, I hear about this a lot, but your report reinforced it, is just the fragmentation of even just housing finance, right? I mean, what could you unpack that a little bit and explain like why maybe it's a little bit obvious, but why is it a giant headache that we have, these various different funding streams? And what would it look like to actually fix that?
Yeah. Yes. So California is very unusual in that we have our financing for affordable housing spread across 2 constitutional officers. So we have certain types of affordable housing funding that are under the governor's office, under our state Department of Housing Community Development, amongst other agencies. We also have a California Housing Finance Agency also under the governor. But the largest program for affordable housing finance is called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is a federal program, but the federal government allocates the tax credits to the state. And then we have a tax credit allocation committee that is under the treasurer. And then we have certain types of tax exempt bond debt, which is basically like low interest debt, also under the treasurer. So half of it's under the treasurer, half of it's under the governor. And basically, if you're an affordable housing developer that's coming in, and I used to do this, you have to apply for, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sources of funding. It's like a layer cake. You can't get all your money just in one shot. And so all of these different financing streams have their own deadlines. They have their own point system. They're competitive and you have to compete. There's all like different point systems. You get points for different things. So if you're a project manager working for one of these affordable housing developers, you're like running around trying to have your one project be this magic unicorn that can like get its tax credit allocation, and then it's, tax exempt debt, and then it's other sources of low cost debt over here, and you're trying to like align it, and then 2-3 years goes by and all of a sudden your costs have escalated. It's like a hot mess and like such a foolish way to set up a system. It just makes, like, one person I was talking to said nobody in their right mind, if you surveyed 10 different experts on affordable housing finance, nobody would set up the system that we have right now. Like not a single person would come up with this cockamamie system and say, yeah, like let's do that. So it really is absolutely ripe for reform. I just came back from Vienna where I got to learn about social housing. So they have a totally different system for financing and creating affordable housing. They've got a mixture of incomes, and they're building everything from like very, very low income people to middle income people. And it's totally different. But one thing that is mind blowing is how easy the financing is. They basically have like, there's like some equity and then there's some debt, and they're like, okay, go, like it's like a 3-4 sources maximum, and they're very clear, and it's very clear how you get the money, and it's not complicated, and you have certainty. And from that certainty, you can basically build at just a much lower cost. So it has happened in this, country that's across the pond. They actually have a affordable housing delivery system that works much better.
So you're saying that we could have nice things?
We could.
We could have nice things.
We could. I mean, the funny thing is, so like, just again, it's not like I've studied deeply the Viennese system, but it came out of a political movement there between the world wars, and then they just built all of this housing. They just built like a crap ton of housing, and people lived in it, and then they got used to it. They're like, oh yeah, of course we have affordable housing here. Of course we have, everybody has healthcare, and it just becomes the norm. And so they're used to it, and so they can build on it politically. And what we're used to is this like crapshoot of, if you were born into a household that can supply intergenerational wealth, or you went to this school, or you got this job, then you have housing security. But if you didn't win the lottery, you don't. And that's the American way. And you have to pull yourself up by your bootstrap, except that doesn't really work very well. And that's what we're used to. So it's hard for us to conceptualize a place that's different, or a way that's different. But when you go somewhere and you see people who are acculturated to this other system, you're like, oh my God, we could have this. These people aren't like smarter than us or better than us. They just are organized differently. They organize themselves around different values.
Well, I mean, another example of looking abroad is, I mean, I think the extent to which we kind of divide up a lot of this planning among thousands of local governments and dozens of counties is really weird by international standards, right? I mean, you're not even proposing anything like statewide zoning, but that would be pretty comparable to what a place like Japan has, where the zoning districts are written at the national level and then local governments map them, maybe with a few special districts. Or France, where same sort of thing, the local government has a lot of control over what we would call the zoning ordinance, even if locals retain some flexibility to map them. We're not even talking about moving to a system like that, right? We're just talking about moving to a system where it's like, okay, you still got to do the local zoning, but like, please, like, do it with some semblance of a compliance with a broader plan, right?
Yep. I mean, I think one thing that's important to remember is that America is like gigantic compared to some of these places. I mean, it's physically much bigger. Our states, well, not all of them, but certainly California is much bigger. And so California is like sort of more analogous to a country. I mean, California is definitely much bigger than Austria is, for example. Like our state is much bigger than their country, both geographically and then in terms of population. So I'm not trying to defend the American system, but it's sometimes like a little bit hard to make the analog because of just the scale differential that we're talking about.
That's true. I mean, Japan has kind of sort of a unified zoning system, though, for a country of 125 million people. California is 40.
Yeah.
But yeah, point taken. I mean, right, even in your plan where you would like to see a lot more regional and state coordination, local governments are still retaining, even as they do today, the vast majority of powers over these decisions. And I guess I wonder, that's from a political perspective, that's, I think, a benefit of the proposal. But from a policy perspective, one of the worries I have is, even if we have a lot more regional and state oversight over entitlement, a local government that still retains power over day-to-day permitting can still basically probably block any housing that they really, really don't want. And I'm wondering, how do we overcome that? And how would that maybe dynamic change in your sort of framework?
Yeah. So, well, one thing I do recommend in the paper is a 40B style appeals process. So if you have, and 40B is a law in Massachusetts that basically allows developers of projects that have like a certain amount affordable in certain types of jurisdictions that haven't built enough affordable housing to appeal to the state for building permits if they're rejected. So I think basically what I would say is, if you have a project that conforms with zoning, and the zoning is required by the RENA process, and there's big sticks if you don't actually do your housing element and your rezoning, so that the zoning, it's likely to actually be there, and you come in with a conforming project, that you can appeal if you're rejected. Like, you can appeal to the state to issue permits.
Man, it would solve so many issues. I mean, one of the challenges that we face is a lot of the laws passed in recent years have included language like what is it? What is the process for deeming an application complete?
Mhm.
Permit stream SB 330, right? Permit Streamlining Act. Okay, there's going to be shot clocks for all these things. If a jurisdiction blows past them, your project is deemed approved, right? It's all well and good in theory, but I mean, most of what I hear from practitioners is, well, okay, in practice, like deemed approved is kind of meaningless. Well, I'm going to go to a court and have them demand, and it's almost always, a sort of toothless threat. And something like a state level board of appeals where it's like, okay, yeah, you blew past a shot clock, your right to entitle and potentially permit this project is going to this separate thing, right? Like that's other states have done mechanisms like that, right? And it's
Mhm.
not only is the sky not falling, but a lot of housing is getting built.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely cuts out some of the mischief that you see. Yeah, exactly like you're saying, the local planners, if they're trying to um, make it harder for a project to move forward because they can deem it not complete, or they can, you can be sent through like endless rounds of review, and you can it can be unclear exactly how you're being denied your right to build in accordance with the zoning by engaging in some of this mischief. But I do think a statewide board of appeals would clear some of that up, and then you wouldn't have to go through litigation to clear it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it is. I think a lot of times it is mischief. It's okay. We really didn't want this ADU or this AB 2011 project that state law is making us allow. Something that I do hear a lot from folks in local government, even some fairly pro housing folks, is okay, guys, the law is changing so quick, and there's so many new reports that we have to do, and there's so many filing requirements. It's getting just beyond what a local government can handle. And I almost wonder, like, if we couldn't do a better job of creating little safe harbor sort of policy framework. So say like, look, okay, you're a small government or a smaller suburb with not a lot of capacity. You're fine. You want to comply, but you don't have multiple planners on staff, right? To do all this work, and you don't have the budget to contract it all out. I'm wondering, yeah, like one of the things I wonder is how do we make it as easy as possible for jurisdictions to do the right thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up this issue of capacity for some of these smaller jurisdictions. And certainly that can be a role actually for a regional government or even a county government to kind of have some of that stronger capacity that the local governments can lean on if they need to increase their capacity or kind of flex in and out. I think that that's actually really important because if you have a small jurisdiction that has like one or two planners, they're not going to be able to keep up with all the laws, and they're not going to be able to keep up with what they need to do. So that I mean, just as simple as like some technical assistance or flex capacity would be really useful.
I think the unification of a lot of the more complex calculations we use in our planning processes would be helpful as well, in terms of, earlier we were talking about how do people designate areas for growth in their communities through like sustainable community strategies. What are those calculations like how do we say that you're going to reduce greenhouse gas reductions, which we talk about as vehicle miles traveled? I mean, if you're a teeny little like town that is part of an overall council of government or transit agency, like that's a big burden, I think, to put on. And yeah, so I guess that was something else I thought would be useful in your report, in terms of having this overall planning agency that hopefully has the gumption to say this is the way we calculate something. Everybody.
Yeah.
No, you don't get to have your own special way of calculating vehicle miles traveled. It's not cute,
Yeah, I know. It's so funny. People come up with these things. They're like, we'll just do it this way. And you're like, no, don't do it that way. Do it the regular way.
Do we want to do a quick lightning round and we can come back to governance? You're familiar with the lightning round, right? I think. So we'll ask you a few short questions. You can take as long or as little as you like, but a one-word answer is perfectly fine. Most underrated cuisine in the Bay Area?
Oh my God. This is really hard. Underrated cuisine. I pass. I don't know what to say. I got to think about it. Ask me a different one.
um,
Unless Robyn, do you have an answer? What do you think the most underrated cuisine is?
Oakland's Ethiopian.
Oh, okay. I agree.
Brave, very brave, Sarah. Okay. Yeah, most underrated city in the Bay Area.
Mm, El
You're a Bay
Cerrito.
Area.
El Cerrito.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Make the
Yeah.
case.
Well, they have a BART station. They might have two BART stations. They've got a really nice commercial corridor that you can go Solano that you can go walk along, and then they've also got kind of a flat part of the city and hills. And also, I have friends that live there, and I always find it to be kind of a nice place to go visit.
And they're getting that nice new big BART development as well. Thank
Yep.
you. Thank you, TOD. Thank you, Transit Oriented Development.
Yep.
Okay, one for you, lightning round, policy related. California Planning Agency, should it subsume LAFCOs?
Oh my God.
That's not a lightning round, Robyn.
Yes.
Great. Started.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. You're formerly at Spur. You get to extend the BART system to any city along any corridor. What's the dream line?
Oh, okay. I gotta do two. So one is along Geary, as it was supposed to be. The Geary 38 is one of the most utilized transit corridors in, I think, the West Coast, and all they have is a bus. And then we worked on bus rapid transit for Geary for like 20 years, and I think maybe they're building it now. I don't even know. It's just like, Robyn, do you know? Is it actually happening, or they just finished the
I haven't
EIR?
seen
I
it
don't
yet.
even know. You haven't seen it yet?
Haven't
Okay.
seen it yet.
So I would have it go along Geary, and then maybe, if we're brave, up through Marin and hit some of the towns in Marin. I think that would be really sweet. And then secondly, I'd have a second Trans-Bay crossing, and then I'd hit kind of potentially other parts of Oakland as well. And Spur did a whole report on where it should go, so I can pull it up for you guys. But I like the idea of a second Trans-Bay crossing. I think there's a lot of possibility both in San Francisco and in Oakland, because in places like DC, they actually do infill BART stations. They do, instead of like an expansion outward, it's like a densification inward, and I think that would be really cool.
Favorite
Love that.
natural day trip out of the Bay Area?
Okay, I got married to my husband at the Headland Center for the Arts in Marin by Rodeo Beach. And so I will say there. It's really pretty.
Robyn, do you have an answer here?
Favorite day trip?
Yeah, favorite natural day trip, let's say.
Favorite natural day trip?
Yeah.
I love all the parks along the spine. I like the Berkeley Hills. Those are lovely. And, it's talking about underrated. Those are really, I think, underrated. Marin's great. I love Marin. It's gorgeous. It's stunning. But yeah, the hills are lovely.
You have to move to a city outside of California, Sarah. Perhaps let's start within the U.S. Where do you go?
Dad.
Let's say purely on the basis of the urbanism, the lifestyle that you want to live.
I went to college in New York City, so I guess I just have to go right back there. Love New York.
Yeah, easy answer, I think. And outside of the U.S.
Well, I fell in love with Vienna, so maybe me and my family should just move over there. I'm just really, really, really impressed with them and their housing system. How about you guys? Where would you live outside the U.S.?
It's tough. I mean, I was in Paris last year, and I mean, it's kind of the real deal. I'd have to get fluent in French. They're very impatient with folks who aren't fluent in French, so I don't even know that I even have a shot. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a popular answer, but things are usually popular for good reason. Mexico City. I mean, it's the real deal. It's a proper mega city that's within a reasonable flight of most of the U.S., and it's pretty cheap if you're on a U.S. salary.
How about you, Robyn?
I'd have to say I love the south of Spain, so like Sevilla. Or a little challenging these days, but love Hong Kong. I would spend some serious time in Hong Kong. Speaking of like great access to nature, lovely little camping spots, and yeah, great spot.
Well, that's maybe a good opportunity to announce the second half of this podcast will be in Mandarin. So, Sarah, you are fluent, right?
It's going to be very short podcast.
Robyn lived in China for a while, and you're fluent, right? I mean, that must have been remarkable, saying just the change of the cities.
Yeah, but that's a no-go in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, my English works. Mandarin does not. They're Cantonese. Very proudly speaking Cantonese. But yeah, no, I lived just across the little strait in Shenzhen, which then there the Mandarin works. But yes.
That's such a remarkable, it's got to be an incredible comp. I mean, the Pearl River Delta, right, for the Bay Area. I mean, in a certain sense, they really are kind of similar in a lot of respects and have gone on a different trajectory maybe over the last 50 or 60 years, right? I mean, they've gone on this total transit building boom tear. I mean, the region is totally integrated by transit in a way that, like, the maybe New York is kind of close, but the Bay Area is like, yeah, not even close, right?
Yeah, well, once we establish the California Planning Agency, we'll be able to build, multiple underground subway lines and 2 hours at least. I was living in Shenzhen, and there were 2 lines. I went back a year and a half later, and there were 7. These are massive, like 2.5, 3 hour end-to-end massive lines. So, look, I have really high hopes for the agency you've described, Sarah. So I'm expecting that in LA shortly.
Great. Let's do it. I'm glad we all decided. We're all in agreement.
Excellent. And that's all that's necessary. Getting back to the report here, just very briefly. Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, so what is the path for creating something like a new California Planning Agency? It has to be cabinet level, has to be constitutional. So that requires a proposition. Walk us through that.
So as I understand it, so first of all, Jerry Brown did a reorg when he was in office. So there actually used to be, I can't remember, I think it was called the Business, Housing, and Transportation Agency. And a woman named Sunny McPeak used to run it. And then Jerry Brown, I guess, and presumably others decided that transportation should really be its own agency. And so they broke out transportation, and then they put business and consumer services in another agency, and housing was like a little like sort of forgotten add-on. They're like, oh yeah, housing's in there. So anyhow, so that's how the BCSH was created, Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency. And then of course, transportation. I always say transit, but really it is transportation, including highway stuff, is in this other agency. So basically what the governor needs to do is come up with a plan, and then it's reviewed by something called a little known commission called the Little Hoover Commission. And the Little Hoover Commission reviews and then makes a recommendation, as I understand it, about whether the reorganization is allowed or disallowed. And then the legislature takes it up, but I believe that they can only affirmatively reject it. So it's kind of a funny little process. But if you're that's only for reorganizing the existing authorities within the state. If you want to add other authorities, I believe then you would need to go through the state legislature.
So we need to get the governor on board, and then we need to find this Little Hoover and get him to approve.
Yes, exactly.
Who is on this commission? I've never heard of this commission.
Well, you should go check it out, because it's an important commission, and people go and testify before it, and they release reports and do all sorts of things. So I think the two of you would be excellent on the Little Hoover Commission, and so I think you should definitely talk to the appointments secretary for the governor and just let them know that you're available to be on it.
We'll get
You'd
right
be
on
really
that.
good. Yeah.
I have a question. It's a bit of a non sequitur, but it is what the Little Hoover Commission is looking at right now. Insurance.
Oh,
Don't know if you've
yeah.
heard about our crisis. What's going on? A lot of folks leaving the state, a lot of folks unable to get insurance, and then a lot of other people facing massive increases in their insurance bill. And I was kind of curious how you think that the many recommendations you laid out in this plan for better housing governance could help address our insurance crisis, if at all, and kind of how you see that playing out with the current crisis.
Yeah. Okay. So the short answer is I'm not sure, but what I would hope, because I don't understand the logic by which the insurers function. Like, I don't understand their mindset. I haven't and I don't know what they're required to do. I didn't know that they could just be like, bye, we're leaving. So there is something both around like how they think about things and then what their responsibilities are, because they do have, it would seem like they would have some type of public responsibility, but it also seems like they're abdicating those responsibilities. So if you set all of that aside and just think about risk, I would assume that one of the things that the California Planning Agency would be thinking about, and that we would all be thinking about, is how to make sure that we're not doubling down on new housing construction in places that are experiencing wildfire risk. And thinking about, for the people who currently live in places that experience wildfire risk, we're sort of hardening those places as much as we can, but we're not putting new people in harm's way. Like, we're not creating the next generation of people living in the WUI where it's like super dangerous and where their life and property are at risk. And that instead we'd be looking at, again, densifying in our infill locations and making sure that we're building in places that are just basically less likely to burn, and that hopefully that would reduce the state's wildfire risk overall, and that we'd be seen as being more desirable to insurers. I mean, that would be the hope, right?
Definitely.
Another question I have for you, a lot of we've mostly been talking about California, if you haven't noticed. All three of the non-California listeners still tuning in. We love you. Thank you for sticking around. I'm wondering, bigger picture, you've spent your career thinking about California governance. You put out this big, great report. Are there any like big picture principles for folks who are wrestling with these issues in other states that you would recommend, maybe drawing on the California experience, for how to think about how to approach housing governance at the state level?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, I actually have, I mentioned before I did this, a similar report, not housing focused, but just on governance in Oakland. And that experience and this one really allowed me to see that there's not like a one size fits all approach. Like, you kind of have to understand the milieu in which you're working and there's some things that might work really well based on like sort of the political ecosystem of one state versus the other. So I'd never say like, Utah, you should do exactly what California did, or, like that just wouldn't ever make any sense. But I do think there's two buckets of types of reforms. There's things that like legislatures can do. And I feel like California has been, at least advocates in California, have been extremely focused on like passing laws and looking at laws. And then there's like the whole question of state capacity. And I think this isn't prescriptive, it's more of like a process recommendation, looking at both like what can be accomplished through the passage of laws, kind of like, this is sort of a top-down approach over here, and what types of institutions are needed and institutional capacity is needed to kind of make systems work as you're passing these laws are two like just really important areas to like spend time thinking about, interrogating, doing interviews around, you know, talking to people, understanding what's working and what isn't. So I would make a recommendation for really looking at both. And then one thing I actually started off doing this paper that I never came back to because we just ran out of time is I think it'd just be really important and something that I would like to do at the Terner Center, like a comparative analysis, looking at a variety of other states. So we've looked at California and I've looked at kind of different cities and how they've increased their zoning capacity, but I'd love to do like just an kind of an org chart comparison to other states, both in terms of their affordable housing delivery systems, but then also like their planning functions and what institutions and authorities they have, and how they're organized and what's been effective and what hasn't. Because I have not yet seen that kind of a comparative analysis, and I want to do it. So, or somebody else can do it and I can read it. That would be great too.
I'd love to chat about it. I mean, part of the work that I've been trying to do more is international comparative work.
Mm-hmm.
But even within the U.S., I think you're exactly right. I mean, there's a lot of variety on how the planning institutions work within the U.S. I mean, sometimes it's extreme, right? In the cases of like smaller states where they kind of sort of do have like statewide zoning system, like Rhode Island, Hawaii. Yeah. I mean, even places like Oregon, California, radically different from New Jersey, Massachusetts. So I would love to see that and encourage you to take that up. I mean, it even within the U.S., it would be helpful because it kind of helps you realize that, yeah, there's a lot of range even within sort of the U.S. cultural, political, economic framework of how these things can work. And some states are probably doing them better, worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think about this quite a bit, being from Seattle originally. And I'm curious, kind of putting a different flip on Nolan's question, Sarah, when you look at some of the mistakes we've made in California over the last, 50 years, give or take, what are the kind of watchwords to others who are not quite as far along in terms of their housing shortage and affordability crisis? People who are ramping up in this respect. What are some of the cautionary tales and things that are really important to not do, housing governance or otherwise?
That's a hard one. Okay, don't pass Prop 13. Anybody starts telling you about capping your property taxes, run the other way, screaming.
Got it. Got it. Check.
I think other states are onto us that was like a catastrophe. So I think that's certainly one. I think anytime people start talking about like local control would be best if we could just devolve to the local government. Like, let's devolve our land use authorities back to local governments. I'd be concerned about that. I'd be pretty concerned about that. So those are two that come to mind immediately.
Great. Well, Robyn, anything else you wanted to cover that we didn't mention? Or Sarah, anything else from the report that you really want to hit home? And, of course, everyone is going to, as soon as this podcast's over, they'll be done washing their dishes or doing their laundry or back home from the walk, and they'll sit down and read the report. But anything else you want to leave folks with?
I think there's one part of the report that I do actually want to highlight, where we talk about the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency, which is pretty new for the Bay Area, and LA has its own version, but it's basically the idea, and I didn't talk about this when we talked about regionalism, but that you have kind of a regional entity that can put bonds on the ballot to create more funding for affordable housing and hold land and do a bunch of other things and provide some of that capacity we were talking about. I think that is just a real game changer. And actually, BAFA is going to have a bond on the ballot this November for for $20 billion for affordable housing. So if you are a listener and you haven't yet made your decision about this proposition, I highly, highly encourage you to vote for it. It's going to be really, really important. Oh, and if you're a state voter, if you live in the great state of California, there will be on the ballot initiative to reduce the voter threshold for affordable housing bonds from 2/3 to 55%. Please also vote for that.
Well, fantastic. Now that Sarah's given you your voter's guide, Sarah, thanks for writing this report and thanks for joining Abundance. I'm incredibly excited about hopefully some of the radical changes that could come out of your work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
It's amazing. It's a tour de force. We're ready. All the recommendations. Let's go.
Let's go.